Hey there, welcome back to session 6 of our series, The Christian and Government, and how it is that a Christian is supposed to relate to their government. It's been a while since I've made a video, a 3 weeks I guess, just been really busy with kids and work and life. But I'm back and am making some time to keep doing this, to keep at this series and get through teaching these little YouTube, 8 to 10 minute sound bites about how the Christian is supposed to relate to the government. So since it's been so long, I just want to start off by reading the text really quickly. I'm reading from the ESV. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For the same reason you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, and honor to whom honor is owed. Okay, today I want to talk about the exceptions to when is it that we are allowed to not submit to the government? When is it that we decide to rebel or decide to be disobedient to the government? Now, somebody may throw a flag on the play, and rightfully so, because in weeks past, as I addressed the issue of all government being from God, I made the statement that there are no exceptions to that all governments come from God. And now I'm saying, well, yes, Paul says that all governments come from God, and yes, he tells us to submit to the government, and he doesn't qualify either one. And yet here I am telling you that all governments coming from God is an absolute statement with no exceptions, and yet I'm telling you that submission does have exceptions. So how can I do that? And you would be right to question me, to throw a flag on the play, so to speak. Well, the answer is we interpret the Bible with the Bible. That's what makes this make sense. We know from the Bible that there are many exceptions to blanket submission to governing authorities. We have examples of people in the Bible rebelling against the governing authorities. So we know that obviously the Bible doesn't contradict itself, that this is not an absolute statement with no exceptions. Whereas all governments coming from God, I'm not going to repeat all that stuff, but we looked at that and we can see that without exception, in every single biblical example that we have, all governments come from God, even the bad ones. People like Nebuchadnezzar, again and again and again, we see that God raised them up. Pharaoh, God raised him up so that he could make his power known through Pharaoh. Over and over and over again, we find that to be the case. And so, submit to the authorities. Now, as a Christian, we have dual authorities, right? We have the ultimate authority, that's God, and we have a secondary authority, that's the government. And, our kids understand this. Our kids are under dual authority all the time. Mom and dad are their ultimate authority, and yet they're under the authority of a teacher at school or a baseball coach at practice. And so our kids actually probably understand this in ways that it would help us to sort of put ourselves in their shoes. Your kid may have a baseball coach, and you've probably told that kid, if the coach says run laps, then you run laps. If he says do push-ups, then you do push-ups. And yet at the same time, your child understands that if the coach was to ask him to do things that would make him disobedient to mom and dad, then he has a responsibility to rebel. For example, this is sort of a ridiculous example, but let's say the coach says that well, before practice, we all have to smoke marijuana joints or drink beer or whatever. Well, your 13-year-old knows that he can't do that, that mom and dad do not allow that. So at that point in time, he has to be civilly disobedient to that governing authority in his life. And yet, even though the coach has said to smoke marijuana joints, and he knows mom and dad don't approve of that, that does not give your child the right to say, well, no, I'm not going to run laps anymore. You see what I'm saying? So there's ways in which we can rebel, but that never authorizes sort of coup d'etats and overthrows and saying, well, fine, you're not the boss of me anymore. That just doesn't happen. And so let's talk about some of the exceptions really quick. Really, I've only been able to find 4 hard, steadfast exceptions in Scripture as to when it is okay to rebel. And those, we'll just go through them really quickly. Number 1, when the government says that we have to worship them. When the government says that we have to worship them. And that sounds kind of foreign to our ears being here in the democratic West, but looking into Bible prophecy, there is a coming world leader called the Antichrist that's going to require worship of him. And the penalty will be beheading to anyone that doesn't. And of course, history is full of that as well. The Caesar worship that was required in the Roman Empire that so many Christians were killed for refusing to engage in. Another example is when the government says that you cannot pray. We saw that in the book of Daniel when Daniel, the king. There was a law that was passed saying that it was illegal to pray to anybody except for the king of Babylon, and Daniel kept right on praying just like he always had, and he ended up finding himself in the lion's den, much like his 3 friends when they refused to worship that statue. They ended up in the fiery furnace. In Acts 4 and 5, we have a picture of Peter and John rebelling when the government tells them that they cannot evangelize. You cannot keep talking about this person, Jesus. And they ended up being beaten and put in prison for a little while. And Peter and John, replied to their accusers, who should we obey, God or men? And another example is when the government tells you to kill someone. We see that the Hebrew midwives in the days of Pharaoh back in Exodus, when they were told to kill the firstborn Hebrew sons and they refused to do it, and God blessed them for not doing it. And these are some exceptions where we are to rebel against the government. But for the most part, when the government wants to oppress us and persecute us, we are not to rebel, but rather to submit. And I want to read a passage in 1 Peter that just illustrates this beautifully. This is 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 12. Now who is there to harm you if you are zealous for what is good? And Peter, somebody needs to throw a flag on the play, because we all know that the very person in charge of the Roman Empire ends up having Peter killed. So yes, just because you're doing good doesn't mean no one's going to harm you. In fact, oftentimes the people that do harm you when you're doing good is the governing authorities. Look what he says, next verse, 1 Peter 3:14. But even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you will be blessed. Have no fear of them, nor be troubled. But in your hearts regard Christ the Lord as holy. And then here's a familiar passage that you've heard many times, but probably never put it in its context. Always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. That's where we get the word apologetics. Yet do it with gentleness and respect. What's Peter saying here? He's saying the times that you are going to suffer for doing good is usually going to be at the hands of governing authorities, and that's actually what he talked about in the previous chapter, was submitting to governing authorities. And so Peter's not ignorant that suffering's going to happen at the hands of governing authorities. But what he's saying is by submitting to it, by just gladly and joyfully allowing yourself to be persecuted, that's going to cause people to say, why in the world are you voluntarily suffering for this Jesus person? That's not normal behavior. When most people suffer unjustly, that's not the normal behavior. The normal behavior is to object and to throw a fit and to want it to change. But you guys are willingly suffering. And when we willingly suffer, guess what people that are oppressing us and the people that witness it are going to say? They're going to say, tell us what it is about this hope that lies in you. And that's why Peter says, always be ready to give a reason for the hope that lies within you. Be ready to explain it, because when you suffer unjustly, people are going to ask, why are you doing that? That's intriguing to them, and explain it to them. And then he says, but do it with gentleness and respect. Don't be in your face and yell and scream and shout about how wrong they are. And so the power in suffering for Christ is in doing it quietly. Like a lamb led before the slaughter, so Jesus did not open his mouth. It's when we suffer willingly that we have this powerful testimony to the world, and they're going to ask questions. Why is it you're doing this? And that stands in sharp contrast to what we see today, where we're starting to see some real persecution in America, and what we see is people immediately lawyering up. Right? I'm calling the ACLJ, and they set off a social media tsunami about how they're suffering and how terrible the government is, and they're pounding their fist on the table, demanding their rights and demanding their liberties, and castigating their oppressors, and yelling and screaming about their civil liberties and the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Well, what we do when we do that, and I understand the Bill of Rights, I understand that we have all those freedoms, and those freedoms are nice, and they've been so very useful to us. But listen, when we do that, what we are taking away from ourselves is for people to look at us and say, why in the world are you suffering like this so willingly? Tell me about the hope that lies within you. We're removing the ability to do that when we behave that way. And so this is why Peter and Jesus and Paul in Romans 13 and 1 Peter 2 tell us to submit to the governing authorities, because it opens the door for us to be able to share the gospel.